Hello, everyone. I am Nurse Melissa, the lucky nurse. And in today's lecture, we're going to go over the circulatory system. We're going to go over the different parts of the circulatory system, the way that blood flows through the circulatory system, and most importantly, we're going to go over the different parts of the heart and how blood flows through the heart. So throughout this video, I will be referring to the circulatory system as the circulatory system, but it can also be called the cardiovascular system or the vascular system. So if you're out in the real world and you hear those terms, just know that they are all the same thing as the circulatory system. So to start with the circulatory system, I'm going to go over the two main functions. Number one is to supply oxygen and nutrients throughout the body. I listed four main parts of the circulatory system, but there's one important aspect of the circulatory system that is not listed on this slide, and that is blood. Blood is constantly circulating throughout the human body, and our blood carries nutrients. It carries vitamins, minerals, sugars, fats, protein, and most importantly, our blood carries oxygen. So, as blood is circulating throughout the body, it is transporting all of that nutrients and that oxygen, and it's supplying that throughout the body into our different organs and into our different tissues. Now, the second main function of the circulatory system is to remove metabolic waste from the body. And again, this is done through the circulation of blood. So as blood circulates through the body, it's essentially collecting waste at the same time that it is supplying nutrients to different parts of the body. So the circulatory system is a very intricate system within the body, and it's able to do multiple things at once and serve different functions. Now, again, the four main parts of the circulatory system are the heart, the arteries, the veins, and the capillaries. So, by and large, the most important part of the circulatory system is the heart. And this is because the heart is the one organ in our body that is actually responsible for pumping blood throughout the body. So, in pumping blood throughout the body, the heart is essentially responsible for supplying oxygen to our different organs, our different tissues, and our different cells. And it's also responsible in helping remove waste products in the body, like I just talked about a moment ago. And we're going to go over the different parts of the heart in this lecture. And that's actually going to be a bulk of this lecture because the heart is extremely important to the circulatory system. Now, the next part of the circulatory system are our blood vessels. And there are three different types of blood vessels, the first being arteries. The arteries are blood vessels that are responsible for transporting oxygen-rich and nutrient-filled blood from the heart through the rest of the body. Another type of blood vessel in the body are our veins. So, like I mentioned earlier, as blood circulates throughout the body and is delivering oxygen and nutrients throughout the body, it's also collecting waste at the same time. So, arteries are responsible for transporting oxygen rich and nutrient rich blood throughout the body. Veins are responsible for collecting oxygen poor blood and waste from the body and carrying it back to the heart. So if you look at this diagram that I have on the right side of the screen, you'll see that the body is filled with blood vessels. And in this diagram, you'll see that some are in red and some are in blue. Typically, but not always, typically your arteries are going to be colored red and the veins are going to be colored blue. And the red coloring in the arteries represents the oxygen-rich blood that is carried throughout the body. And then the blue in the veins is supposed to signify deoxygenated blood. So what always helps me is whenever, you're watching TV or if you've seen a patient in real life who is not having enough oxygen or they're struggling to get oxygen, they're going to start turning blue. So that kind of helps me remember, okay, whenever I see blue, that means that there's a lack of oxygen and that is a vein, usually, but not always. And then lastly, the last type of blood vessels in the body are the capillaries. So capillaries are tiny blood vessels, and they're actually the smallest, most delicate blood vessels in the body. The capillaries are where oxygen and nutrients are exchanged for carbon dioxide and waste. So what that means is that oxygen and nutrients from the blood can move through these very tiny, very delicate walls of the capillaries to get into organs and tissues. And the capillaries also take waste products away from the tissues. So although the capillaries are tiny, they are very, very important. And to the right side of the slide, there is a close-up of what the capillaries actually look like. So you have arteries, which have oxygen and nutrients, and then you have veins, which have waste and deoxygenated blood. So the capillaries are essentially a connection between the arteries and the veins where an exchange occurs. So now that we've gone over each part of the circulatory system and the function of each part of the circulatory system, we're going to go over the pathway of the circulatory system. So this is how blood actually flows throughout the body. So first we start with the heart. The heart has oxygen-rich blood that is packed with nutrients, and the heart takes that blood and it pumps it through the arteries to the rest of the body. And as that blood travels through the body and reaches different organs and tissues in the body, the blood will travel through arterioles. Now, I don't want you to focus too much on arterioles for the purpose of this lecture. All that you need to know is that arterioles are basically a link between the arteries and the capillaries. And so that blood will then enter into the capillaries. And this is the site where the exchange from oxygen and nutrients will happen, and that the oxygen will turn into carbon dioxide and waste. So from the capillaries, blood then moves through the venules to the veins. Now, I don't want you to focus too much on what venules are in this lecture. Just know that venules are essentially a link between the capillaries and the veins, in the same way that arterioles are a link between the capillaries and the arteries. So now the blood circulating in the body is carrying waste. It is deoxygenated and it has waste because remember that oxygen and those nutrients were exchanged into waste products inside of the capillaries. So the blood traveled from the capillaries into the venules, into the veins, and now the veins have the job of taking that deoxygenated blood full of waste and transporting it back up to the heart. And then the cycle starts over again with oxygen-rich blood being pumped from the heart through the arteries and throughout the rest of the body. So now if you were following along with me, you may have noticed that deoxygenated blood entered into the heart, and yet somehow oxygen-rich, nutrient-rich blood is somehow magically being pumped out of the heart and throughout the rest of the body. That's because there's an entire process of deoxygenated blood becoming oxygenated. Blood flow through the heart is very complex and intricate, and it's very important to understand because it's a concept that's going to continuously pop up throughout nursing school and throughout your profession. And getting a clear understanding of that is going to help you grasp certain conditions involving the heart, like heart failure, for example. And I'll cover heart failure in a different lecture, but for the rest of this lecture, I'm really going to take time explaining the different parts of the heart, the function of each part of the heart, and how blood flows through the heart. And I'll even cut out this next portion of the video and probably upload it separately so that you can replay that as many times as you need to really understand the concepts of how blood flows through the heart. So now we're going to go over parts of the heart. So on this slide, I have labeled all the different parts of the heart that we'll be going over. And in this diagram, the heart is cut in half. So what you're looking at is basically the inside of the heart. So the entire heart is important, but arguably the most important part of the heart would be something that we in healthcare call the four chambers of the heart. And the four chambers are made up of two upper components and two lower components. And the two upper components are called the atria. There's a right atrium and a left atrium. And the right atrium is located on the right side of the heart, and its job is to receive deoxygenated blood from the body. So when blood first enters the heart, it is going to the right atrium. Next, we have the left atrium. The left atrium receives oxygenated blood from the lungs, and this will make more sense as we get further into the lecture and we talk about how blood flows through the heart. But the two upper chambers of the heart are the atrium, and there is the right atrium, and then there's the left atrium. Now, the other two chambers of the heart, the bottom chambers, are the ventricles. There's a right ventricle and a left ventricle. And the job of the right ventricle is to pump deoxygenated blood into the lungs. The job of the left ventricle is to pump oxygenated blood out of the heart and to the rest of the body. Now we're going to go over the valves. The valves of the heart are important because they are what control the direction of blood flow in the heart. And there are four valves. There is the tricuspid valve, the mitral valve, the pulmonary valve, and the aortic valve. And the tricuspid valve is what separates the right atrium from the right ventricle. And its purpose is to prevent the backflow of blood from the right ventricle back into the right atrium. The mitral valve, which is also called the bicuspid valve, so if you see that, don't get confused. They're the same thing. But the mitral valve is what separates the left atrium from the left ventricle. And the mitral valve prevents the backflow of blood from the left ventricle to the left atrium. Now, the pulmonary valve separates the right ventricle from the pulmonary artery, and its purpose is to prevent blood from backflowing from the lungs to the left ventricle. And then lastly, we have the aortic valve, which separates the left ventricle from the aorta. And we're going to cover that next. But the purpose of the aortic valve is to prevent blood from flowing back into the left ventricle after it has been pumped into the body. So essentially, the valves of the heart, there's an entire system and an entire flow of the heart and of blood in the heart. And these valves prevent there from being a backup or prevent there from being a backflow of blood. So it really helps blood flowing forward and prevents blood from getting backed up into the heart. So the valves are extremely important. And then lastly, we have our arteries and our veins that are attached to the heart. Now, remember I said that arteries are usually colored red in diagrams. And while that's usually true, I don't want you to focus on that in this lecture. What's more important to know is that any blood vessels that you see in red are carrying oxygen-rich blood. And any vessels that you see in blue or that are colored blue are carrying deoxygenated blood. So typically the job of the arteries is to deliver oxygenated blood through the entire body. And the biggest artery in the human body is the aorta. A smaller but also very important artery, another artery in the body, is the pulmonary artery. So the pulmonary artery is colored blue because it carries deoxygenated blood from the heart and takes it into the lungs. So that's the job of the pulmonary artery. Now, the job of the pulmonary vein is to take oxygenated blood from the lungs and carry it back into the heart. And then lastly, we have the inferior and superior vena cavas. And these are large veins that deliver deoxygenated blood from the body and they bring it to the heart. So now that we've gone over all the different parts of the heart, we're going to talk about how blood flows through the heart. So blood flow through the heart is a pretty cool and intricate process, and we're going to break it down step by step. First, used up deoxygenated blood from the body enters the inferior and superior vena cavas. And again, the inferior and superior vena cavas are colored blue to signify that the blood traveling through them is deoxygenated. Next, the deoxygenated blood that traveled through the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava is going to dump into the right atrium. So deoxygenated blood has officially entered the heart, and its first stop is the right atrium, but it doesn't actually stop there. So blood flow in the heart is a continuous process. So right when it hits the right atrium, it is going to immediately go through the tricuspid valve and enter into the right ventricle. So next, that deoxygenated blood that traveled through the superior and inferior vena cavas is going to dump into the right atrium. So now blood has officially entered into the heart, and the first stop is in the right atrium. But the blood doesn't actually stop there because blood flow through the heart is a continuous process. I want you to remember that. In a healthy heart, blood is going to continuously flow. It's not going to stop. So right when deoxygenated blood enters into the right atrium, it's immediately going to flow through the tricuspid valve and into the right ventricle. And then once blood enters into the right ventricle is then going to pump that blood up through the pulmonic valve and through the pulmonic artery into the lungs. Now notice that the pulmonic artery is blue, and that is because the blood that is traveling through it into the lungs, at this time that blood is still deoxygenated, it's still carrying waste products. So the blood entering the lungs does not have oxygen. It's important to know that. The whole reason that the blood is being pumped into the lungs is because that is where it's going to become oxygenated. There's an entire gas exchange process that happens in the lungs that is very intricate, and we will cover that in a different lecture video. So deoxygenated blood entered the lungs, a gas exchange occurred, and now that blood has become oxygenated. So that newly oxygen-rich blood then travels from the lungs through the pulmonary veins, and it's dumped into the left atrium. And notice how the pulmonary veins are red. That is because the blood traveling through it is now newly oxygenated. I also want you to take note that in the diagram of the heart where you see the arrows pointing, the pulmonary veins are both on the right and the left side. Even though there are pulmonary veins right next to the right atrium in this diagram, I want you to please take note that the blood is not being pumped into the right atrium. It is wrapping around the heart and going into the left atrium. So that newly oxygen-rich blood from the lungs is only pumping into the left atrium. And right after that oxygen-rich blood enters into the left atrium, it doesn't stay there because remember, blood flow through the heart is continuous. So it will travel from the left atrium through the mitral valve and into the left ventricle. And then lastly, once that oxygen-rich blood enters into the left ventricle will then take that blood and pump it up and out through the aortic valve and through the aorta, where that oxygen-rich blood will then be pumped and distributed throughout the body. So the oxygen-rich blood has now been pumped out of the heart, and it is going to be distributed throughout the different organs, tissues, and cells of the body. And that is how blood flows through the heart. And that was a very, very basic rundown of the circulatory system, the different parts in it, and how it works. Now, this is a very high yield concept, especially the different parts of the heart and especially how blood flows through the heart. So if you watch this entire video straight through and you still do not fully understand the concepts or you feel lost, that is perfectly normal. I would advise now going back and watching the video over again, watching different parts of the video, and just replaying how blood flows throughout the heart in your spare time. It's going to take a while to understand these concepts, but it's very important that you do because, like I mentioned earlier, blood flow through the heart is a large concept in nursing school. It's going to keep popping up, and it's going to be important to understand these concepts when you are learning about different diseases that involve the heart and that involve blood flow throughout the body. That is it for this lecture video. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, please comment down below. If you have any private questions, please feel free to shoot me an email. My email address is in the description box below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you soon.